Let me introduce to you today, that's kind of the sermon title. This passage is easily one of the high points, if not the high point, of the entire book of Acts. I would have loved to have been a fly on the, I would say wall, but that's not really accurate, which I'll explain in a second, just to observe everything that goes on. I don't really, the places I would like to see around the world, Greece for some reason has never been on my list, but I would love to just drop into this spot and spend a couple hours there. This is a place called the Areopagus, sometimes known as Mars Hill. Paul had made his way into Europe. That's where we were last week. And he had made his way down through the area we know as Greece. And he made his way to Athens. Well, there's been a lot of movies. 300 and a few others. You had the ancient Greek civil war between Sparta and Athens. When the Greek Empire ruled the world, Athens was kind of the capital of everything that happened. In the middle of Athens, it's not the highest point in town. There is a low, it's a high point, it's a low hill, but it's very rocky, and it's almost like a flat area on top. That's the Areopagus. Back when Greece was powerful, the council of the town would meet there, decide the affairs of state. By the time Paul gets to Athens, Greece has long since departed from a world power. Rome now rules everything. Greece is kind of a backwater, but you could call it an academic center. And while the town council, that's not really what it was used for, the philosophers, people who like to espouse philosophy and hear the latest ideas floating around the empire, would meet on the Areopagus. And Athens was known for its philosophical life. So Paul makes his way to Athens and boldly steps up and goes to the Areopagus and stands in the middle of all the other philosophers and introduces them to this new philosophy. It's called Christianity. And Paul is telling these men these things for the first time. This is the day where Christianity made its entrance into the philosophical arena and offered itself as an alternative to everything that was going on in the world at this time. Well, what was going on in the world at this time? Well, in the Roman Empire, you had a number of gods. Greece would have still had their gods on Mount Olympus. You still had temples to Aphrodite. It's the god of erotic love, or the goddess of erotic love. You had the temple of Asclepios, which was the god of healing. You had the temple to Neptune, that's the god of the waters, the underworld. You had the god of Apollo and a variety of others. Demeter. In the Roman Empire, by this time, we have started this idea of emperor worship. Caesar is Lord. Caesar is a son of God. So when the New Testament calls Jesus the Son of God, yes, it's a theological statement, but trust me, it is a political dig at the emperor. In some ways, we're now in 2020. Been writing that the last 3 weeks. It's odd for me to write 2020. I don't know what it is. The fact that it matches the first two letters, I'm not quite certain what I'm supposed to do here. We have forgotten some of the things we used to know. We've forgotten some of our philosophical underpinnings of Christianity. Some people have heard a portrayal that has left them distant and discouraged. To be honest, in a lot of places we've abandoned the playing field and then are surprised that in some circles we've lost influence. Maybe it's time to introduce you again to this Jesus. I'm reading out of Acts chapter 17. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. Nor is he served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your poets have said, we are his offspring. It moves on from there, but I'll stop here. So here's Paul introducing them to this idea. And the first thing he says is, listen, everything you see, God made it. Now, for years, there simply was no creation. Go back into the middle of the last century, the 1930s, 1940s. So you'd have asked a bunch of scientists, physicists, Albert Einstein himself described the universe. They would have looked at you and said, the universe simply is. It has always been, it always will be. It is this steady thing that just existed. And what's funny, Einstein's own mathematics led down to a road where he would suggest that the universe had an initial point of creation. And he knew it, but he couldn't get past his own feeling that it just simply was always there. And all of a sudden now, just in our lifetimes, if you're a teen, not your lifetime, some of our lifetimes, we now know that the universe had a point of creation. It started. If you ask them, they'll say, wait a minute, well, there was something there. It was this incredibly small, incredibly dense. They say probably not much more big than this. And then all of a sudden, it just exploded and literally made everything that you see. All right? I'll go down that road with you. And I'm not casting doubt on any of that. Here's my question. How? What was the cause? And more importantly, why? There are still those who argue that life is the random result of a random explosion. Maybe. Let's just go down through a list here of the things that need to happen in order for our existence, life as we know it, to be able to happen. We need to have a sun. All right? There's lots of those around in the universe. However, we need to have a sun that exists probably in a spiral galaxy. Wow, that's Milky Way. And not in the middle. It's got to be out at the edges, because if it's in the middle, there's too much stuff smashing into each other. The stars are so close that if one star goes bad, radiation overwhelms everything. It's kind of got to be on one of the outer bands. Oh, and by the way, it needs to be a star that burns steadily over millions and millions and millions and millions of years. That immediately wipes out most of the stars in the universe and most of the stars in the galaxy, which sometimes burn with fluctuating intensity. Hope I'm not losing anybody yet. By the way, there needs to be planets around that sun, and you need to have a planet that happens to exist in what's a very narrow zone. Where, like Goldilocks in the porridge, it's not too hot, nor is it too cold. It's got to be just right. And that planet has to exist in a circular orbit, not an elliptical one, where they're going in and out of that zone. It has to be just steadily in that zone. Okay, we've just wiped out almost everything, but I'm not even half done yet. The planet needs to have a moon, and a relatively big moon, a moon that's far bigger than a planet that size should have. Because then that moon will exert tidal forces on the planet, which is a key component to starting life. I'm not even started yet. The planet, by the way, needs to be tilted on an axis. It can't be straight, or it gets hotter and hotter and hotter and colder and colder and colder. It's got to be tilted so it has seasons that keeps everything balanced. Again, now we've wiped out even more things. And by the way, it needs to have another planet somewhere else in their solar system that's huge. So then when you get the big, asteroids that would wipe out stuff with some regularity, that planet would soak all that up and make it crash into that instead of the little planet. Oh, by the way, it needs to have something called water in abundance. It needs to have an atmosphere that's largely made up of oxygen. Oh, and by the way, and while we view as it kind of a disaster, the planet has to have volcanoes and plate tectonics, which means earthquakes. Because I know they're kind of bad news, especially those people in California, but you kind of need it to happen in order for stuff to work as it should. And last but not least, this planet needs to have an inner core made up largely of iron so that it has its own magnetic field to keep the sun's magnetic field from roasting everybody during the middle of this sermon. That's a lot. And by the way, the list goes on from here. I stopped at 9. And I could have gone on to about 30 things. Why would I waste time on a Sunday morning? Just to make this suggestion that often the things we see is a place of intricate design. It's baseball season coming up. In about 3 weeks, we can say pitchers and catchers report. And here's what happens, and I'm an Indians fan. I'm not a valueless front-runner Yankees fan. I'm an Indians fan. And so my season starts off like this, like Cubs fans used to for years and years and years. Well, if we get that third pitcher, and if the bullpen holds up, and if we get a hitter, and if this guy has a career season, then we might be in it at the end of the year. Once you get past your second if, you're just dreaming. That's a baseball thing. I just gave you 10 ifs of far less probability than a bullpen and a third starting pitcher. And I didn't get into the more valuable things of creation and design, which isn't the things we see, things like beauty and melody and harmony and self-sacrifice and love, those qualities that really make life worth living. We live in a place of such intense beauty. And I know some of you have places you like to go. Favorite places in the world. And I'll always go back to, there was a number of days my wife and I, and there's lots of places, but we always go back to these 4 days we're at Glacier National Park. And there was an afternoon we were up at the top, at the pass. And there's about a 1.5 mile hike to a place called Hidden Lake. And about time we got out of the parked at the parking lot, it decided to snow really, really hard. So by the time we made it to Hidden Lake, we were hiking through snow. And I don't think we were really dressed for a winter hike. But we made it there, and on the way back, the sun came out. Immediately starting to melt everything that's just fallen. I don't know, I can't do this justice. There's peaks all around us. There's these little hollows, and we're walking, and as it's melting, you could not look in any direction and not see hundreds of waterfalls. I mean, they were maybe this wide. Some were wider. Some were quite vigorous. But in every direction, it was green, and it was September, so stuff was red and gold, and you had these waterfalls. And there were no words to describe. a place of such immense beauty and such consistency in all the ifs certainly reflect the mind of something. Paul goes on in Acts chapter 17 when he says this. He says, God is not served by human hands as if he needed everything, because he gives all men life and breath and everything else. And he determined the time set, the exact places where they should live. And God did this so that all men would seek him and perhaps reach out. We have an inherent need that we were born with. We need each other. And we have a need to belong, and we have this inherent need to seek God. Every so often, and it still happens. It might be in the Amazon jungle, it might be somewhere in Micronesia, in the New Guinea, that archipelago, might be down in there. We occasionally run into a tribe that we've never run into before, that are isolated. And all of them worship. They might worship a stone. They might worship a figure, a face on a piece of wood. They have something set up somewhere, and they're bowing down in worship. It seems to be inherent. Some of you have read science magazines that talk about, is there a God gene? Because that's how inbred, inherent it seems to be in all of us. We have a need to worship. 10,000 years ago, including some of these Greek gods we just talked about, people felt the need to worship the earth. Those silly, backward, primitive people. I'm so glad I live in 2020 where we worship, oh my goodness, the earth again. Never mind. Seems we're also created to have a certain restlessness in us. Paul seems to want to tell us here that that restlessness should lead us toward God. So our choice, and I know Sam Dawkins and Douglas Murray and some of the Richard Dawkins, some of those people out there will tell you the choice is whether to worship or not to worship. I don't think so. I think the human condition tells us our choice is, what do we worship? For we all worship something. I guarantee you, in 2020, as in 2016 and 2012 and 2028, there'll be an election. Someone's candidate will win. Someone's candidate will lose. And there'll be thousands of people in a room in tears as if their life just ended. Because there's an element of worship in carrying around those signs. There's an element of worship in thinking that my life will be determined by who sits in a big White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. So what we do as people, we tend to replace that yearning with 1,000 things that take its place. Things that diminish and end up destroying. We allow sex, drugs, pleasure seeking of a whole host of areas to replace that yearning for God. We've replaced a worship of the God of the universe with worshiping power and politics in our own day, putting what belongs to God and we transfer it onto another human being or another person. We seek money and comfort at the expense of everything else. Look, please don't take that. Given a choice between a comfortable chair and a non-comfortable chair, I want to sit in a comfortable chair. Given the choice between being broke and having some money in the bank, I want money in the bank. But I'm not going to sacrifice my worship. I'm not going to sacrifice God to seek out those things either. And this phrase we find at the end, and it's interesting. Paul says, God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for God. Perhaps. This word in this passage is amongst the saddest words in Scripture. Perhaps. Paul's already said God is near us, far nearer than we appreciate, and is calling out for us all the time. And our response is perhaps. Perhaps. See, God seeks everyone. There is no one who is on the inside track at the expense of everybody else. There is no one that's been predetermined and everybody else has been predetermined to miss out. No one. God's grace goes to everyone. When I was 20, I've said it before, there were about 57 hills I was ready to die on. That's the problem with youth. Now there's about 3. And I don't see that diminishing any further. And one of those hills is God's grace goes to everyone. No one's out. The sad part is not that God has decided ahead of time who to leave out. The problem is we decide ourselves that we're going to be out. And I'm going to run my own show. And I'm going to be in control of this thing. And I'm going to do whatever I think's best. And I'm going to just put off God. That word perhaps. We've all seen the love story where the person ignores the person that everybody knows is best for them to pursue this guy or this girl who's gorgeous and has money and all the things, but we know they don't treat them right, and they make the bad decision, and we hurt for the character. The problem is we do not respond, even though each of us is able. Why would we do that? Well, pride, control, selfishness. Pride is like salt. Doctors will tell you, or sugar, a little bit of salt is a good thing. A whole lot of salt will kill you. A little bit of occasional sugar is a good thing. Every meal, you're dead. A little bit of pride is a good thing. I want people to drive by my house. I want my house to look presentable. Pride is a part of that. I don't want my yard to have any of those evil yellow flowers blooming in them. I want it to be one color. I want it to be green. I don't want any of those foreign invaders. A little bit of pride is good. If I go out in public, you ever go into a store and see the people standing in front of you and you wonder, what is the string of decision making that led you to leave your house looking like that and standing in front of me? And what contest did I lose to have to stand behind you and look at this? A little pride is a good thing. A little bit of control is a good thing. I don't know, I just get a paycheck. I don't know what I do with it. It goes somewhere, and I don't know. I want a little bit of control. I want you to know, have a little bit of a budget. I want you to be able to trace where things are. I want you to be able to make some wise decisions. All that's good. None of those things are inherently bad. But when we exercise them at the expense of God, we have an issue. It's been a couple years since I've told this story, so some of you will remember it, some of you will not. I was about 17 years old, and I was at my grandmother's house. And I could tell you exactly where I was watching. It was the Cleveland Browns New York Jets playoff game. And I knew the Browns would lose because I'm a Browns fan. I know how things work. And she said, while you're here at my house, I'm going to run to the grocery store. I said, that's wonderful. She goes, I'll be back pretty soon. The grocery store's on the corner. She came back 20 minutes later. She popped her head in. She had that look, that I want to tell you a story look, which is normally fine, but it was the third quarter. But I knew enough. I turned it off, and I said, yes. And she said, well, I went to the store. I said, okay. And I had these 4 things on my list. Chipped ham, which is always on her list. Peppermint stick ice cream, which is always on her list. Bread and something else. Okay. But the bananas were on sale. 39 cents a pound. This was 84 or something. I don't know what they are now. My wife would be able to tell you. I have no idea. 39 cents a pound. Yes, that was such a good price. But it wasn't on my list. So I prayed. Lord, this is not on my list. Would it be okay if I got these bananas? Do you think that would be wise? And I think I kept a straight face. Because what I was thinking was, remember, I was about 17 years old. What I was thinking was, good Lord, grandmother, God gave you a brain for 39-cent bananas. I think this is one you can figure out. And I was probably right that she probably could have figured it out. But she was more right than me. Here's what I mean. And I'm not saying that anybody's wrong if you don't pray over 39-cent bananas. That's not the lesson. Here's the lesson. My grandmother so desired to live a life under the control of God's Spirit, she was willing to pray over whether to buy 39-cent bananas. Our problem spiritually is not that we don't exert enough control. Most people in this room, our problem is we exert way too much control at the expense of God. That's one of Paul's points to these Greeks. He's so close. He's so near. He's everywhere. And perhaps you could reach out. Perhaps. The last thing he says, we have a source. God is the source of everything. It's said in Genesis chapter 3, or Genesis chapter 2, the second half, or the second part of the creation story. And God breathed into the man's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now, it's 2020. We realize that when ancient authors said we're not leaving anybody out there. We live in a new age. This was inclusive language in 1000 BC. The text is clear. We do not really live unless God is in us. Verse 25 of our Acts passage, he is not served because he gives all men life and breath and everything else. And that verse 28, for in him, Christ, we live and move and have our being. We move. Who are we going to follow? We have a choice. Who are we going to follow? The world out there? Are we going to follow them? Have you seen the mess out there? You see the people that are talking? You're going to follow them? Going to follow ourselves? Hey, I love you. You might not be the most reliable guide in everything. I might not be the most reliable guide for me to follow. Or do we follow God? It's that last phrase. In him we live and move and have our being. That's a beautiful phrase. It's a strong description. We do not want this to be true at its heart. Often we want our being to be in what we decide. It's interesting how this has worked. It hasn't been that long ago. Again, my lifetime, if you're under a certain age, it's going to be terrifying to you. We'd come home from school and we'd turn on the TV and we had 4 channels. Now, I didn't grow up in Chicago. Here in Chicago, you probably had 8. I had 4. And everybody watched the same 4 channels. Now we have 843 channels. We have 3 cooking channels. We have 3 home improvement channels. You can watch, there's the Chip and Joanna show that everybody loves. Why do I know their names? But anyway, we have the Chip and Joanna show. We have the Windy City Rehab. There's a Chicago show. And then I found out last night, because my wife was watching it, there's one in a little town in Mississippi show. So you can have your Waco, Texas themed house, you can have your Chicago themed house, or your Southern Mississippi themed house. I don't want the Southern Mississippi themed house. You can have your Iron Chef. You can have your best cook. You can have all these food preparation things. You got a guy that comes out, they do a gong. Your secret ingredient is squid. No, I'm out. I'll go to McDonald's. We have such individualized tastes. We take pride in our communities. I do the same thing. Back of my car. You look at the back of my car I drive around. I got a little sticker of all the Great Lakes. On my window, my Great Lakes sticker. And then I got my M22 sticker over here. It's a highway in Michigan. Some of you have been on it. It hugs the coast. Great places to hike, canoe, and a few golf courses. Anyway, and it's on my way. It's kind of we kind of identify. I drive in the city around town, and every day I'll usually find another car with an M22 sticker on it. I want to know who my people are in like a pinch. Sometimes we have our being in our little choices. Paul says, no, in Christ we live and move and have our being. That's different. Most people, even most Christians, want God to be a part of our lives. We want to be good people. We want God to be a part. We want that to be known. What part? The part I control. I decide how big that part is. It's a part we control very tightly. That's different than what Paul describes. In Him we have our being. There's some wonderful, wonderful, great people in the world. And I love these people who want God to be a part of their lives. And that part they control. Here's the news. I'll share it just this morning. You can view it as good news or bad news. That's up to you. God does not seek to be a part of your life that you control very tightly. He seeks your life. He seeks all of you. The rough corner that you need to be softened, the mistake that you keep making, the part that you control very tightly. What Paul describes is not a half-hearted life, but a wholehearted life. And that's my wish for all of us. Our source is not our own talent, is not our own strength. As we move forward in this year, my prayer for all of us is that you will consecrate your life to the God in whose hands your life is completely secure, more secure than your own.